Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and this is just going to be a demonstration of why Vdroop is good. So we're on a 3950X on the MSI X570 Godlike. So thank you MSI for the motherboard. Thank you to the patrons for the oscilloscope and the 3950X and the memory kit and the active probe and, you know, basically everything else in the system here. Though it does help that I don't, at least I don't have to buy my $700 motherboards, right? So thanks MSI for the board, and yeah, the Patreon makes videos like this possible, because ultimately, like, you know, the test equipment is actually, honestly, more expensive. And speaking of the test equipment, it's not even that great. So the setup here, the yellow line, that is a 10x passive probe with no bandwidth limit. So the oscilloscope I'm using is a Rigol DS1054Z, but it's unlocked all the way up to 100 megahertz. So this right here is and the 10x probe is in 10x because at 10x it actually has a, I think, 150 megahertz bandwidth. So, you know, we have like a high bandwidth measurement up here, except the thing is the passive probe is like, it has a bunch of input capacitance, and I think like the Intel spec for taking voltage regulator measurements is that you're supposed to use, I think, a 1.5 picofarad probe, and I think this one is somewhere in the range of 7. So yeah, it is smoothing over the spikes and dips quite heavily. But we can still kind of see what's going on, so it's good enough for the purposes of illustrating what's going on. And it's on it also, like, you know, if you test two different motherboards using the same probe that applies the sort of same amount of smoothing over things, you can still make comparisons. They're just not as accurate as they could be if you had the correct test equipment that costs... Well, let's put it this way. When I was at Gigabyte HQ in Taiwan, doing these kinds of measurements with, like, proper equipment for this, the probe we were using was, I think, around $1,500 for just the probe. And then the oscilloscope was, like, another $7,000. So, yeah, there's no way I'm ever getting that kind of test equipment. Yeah, there's just no way. Like, even if it was like, because saving up that long, like, I wouldn't be able to buy any hardware for, like, over a year to save up that much for just an oscilloscope and a probe. So, yeah, realistically, not happening. I'm not getting that kind of test equipment. Anyway, so, yeah, the yellow line, that's a 10x probe. And unfortunately, it is smoothing things over. Now, there are ways that I could have taken a better measurement. But the thing is, I'm measuring off the back of the socket anyway, and it's just not that, like I don't, like, because we're measuring off of the back of the socket, the measurement isn't that great in the first place. So, you know, yes, I could have gone with just a piece of coax right to the back of the socket. That would have probably, you know, that would probably have less input capacitance on it. The issue is, it would still be a measurement off the back of the socket, so it would suck anyway. The purple line is a 1x active probe. Thank you, Patreons, for that as well. And that, unfortunately, only has 15 megahertz bandwidth, and then there's also, like, I have the 20 megahertz bandwidth limit from the scope on it, because otherwise... Well, actually, it doesn't really make much of a difference, does it? But the thing is, that probe, unfortunately, just picks up tons and tons of noise, and it's not from the actual system. Like, that probe is just really noisy. So, it's mostly here to show and that's hooked up to the DiSense of the motherboard, so that's actually seeing the at-silicon voltages. So that's at the correct voltage levels, it's just there's a bunch of garbage on top of it. So, also, like, basically we have two measurements where it's like, they are indicative of what's going on. They are not actually what's going on. Anyway, so the demonstration is going to be, we're going to run some Prime 95, and I'm going to run a set of settings that are going to have a, well, I'm going to crash the system, and then we're going to run some settings that are going to be a lot more stable. Now, we're not going to say 100% stable because I'm not interested, there's no good way of showing that a Prime 95 run isn't going to crash in the next 10 hours, right? Like, that's just not practical as a demonstration. So we're going to go with settings that are going to crash very quickly, and then run settings that aren't going to crash very quickly at a lower voltage. Which, in my opinion, at a lower average voltage, not a lower minimum voltage, because obviously that's why we have the oscilloscope here, because the oscilloscope can show us our minimums not just the average, right? Because the yellow line, yeah, that's what, your like this. If we were looking at like a software voltage reading, the yellow line is what the software would be reading. And in fact, right now in the BIOS, that's exactly what we see, right? The vCore voltage reading in the BIOS is 1.358 volts. The average voltage reading, according to our oscilloscope right here, is 1.35 volts because that's a super I/O measurement in the BIOS. So the average voltage on the actual die is about 1.34. So there's, the super I/O measures from the back of the socket. So the super I/O reading should match our yellow line for the average voltage, but our minimum voltage is 1.3 volts. So basically what that's telling us is like the bottom of the spike here, right? Like the bottom of that yellow spike, that's about 1.3 volts. And then, like, I wish my oscilloscope would actually go to 3 digits on the measurements, but it doesn't. It only does 3 digits. I mean, go to 4 digits on the measurements, but it only does 3 digits. So that's another limitation of using a cheap scope, which yeah, kind of sucks. But oscilloscopes get really, really expensive really, really fast if you want anything that's, well, yeah, like more appropriate for these kinds of measurements. Like, so anyway, but we can still work with this. So anyway, so that's kind of the difference between like average voltage and minimum voltage. So the average voltage is going to go down, but the minimum voltage is actually going to go up for the stability. So and the minimum voltage, like you have to understand. So right now we're at 200 microseconds per division. So that means this entire event here is 200 microseconds long. The fastest update rate I've seen on most monitoring software is about 1 millisecond. So your monitoring software in Windows is never going to see anything like this. It's never going to pick up on something like that because this is a 200 microsecond event. And actually, that's not even really a 200 microsecond event because like it's back up to 1.35 volts before, the end of that division. So yeah, but you get the idea. Like that's a sub 200 microsecond event. Your software is never ever going to pick up on that. So you're never going to see it, but it is going to affect your stability. Anyway, so first we're going to punch in some settings with no droop whatsoever. So this being an MSI motherboard, and we're just going to put the oscilloscope out of the way over here. So also I'm running 3466 megahertz CJR. It's the G-Skill Trident Z memory kit. And the reason why I'm running this kit is 3466 is just a very convenient speed where I can enable the XMP and not bother to do anything else. So, like, this kit just doesn't do anything weird with timings, and it's just a convenient kit. It's not the fastest thing I could be running, but it's just convenient for this kind of basic testing. So we're going to punch in 1.225. We're going to go to mode 1 LLC, which is no droop. This is a MSI, motherboard, which they show the, like, the load line graphs that MSI has in their BIOS. Those reflect what's going to happen to the Super I/O voltage reading, not what's going to happen to the DiSense reading. So right now we're going to get 1.225 volts DiSense and 1.225 volt SVI2 TFN reading. And we're going to get, like a lot more voltage than that on the actual back of the socket. So we're going to do that. And this is just going to be a 4.2 gigahertz overclock, which is not really that aggressive. And we're going to crash this. Let's blow up the oscilloscope. And then I'm going to run this in a configuration that's not going to crash. So I'm just going to change where the trigger is. Actually, do I have it on channel 3? Okay, yeah, cool. So I'm just checking that I'll be able to put the purple line away. Because the purple line, unfortunately, like, it's going to overlap with the yellow one, and it's going to, like, the yellow one is the one where you can clearly see what's going on. The purple one is kind of just to give us a rough idea of voltage levels at the actual silicon. So, we're going to be using hardware info and Prime 95, and I just covered up the stuff, so we're just going to put that away. Run. And so we're going to run 192K FFT size because that causes by far the worst transients. And the thing is, you can actually, like, there's the reason I like using Prime 95 for transient response testing is because we can very easily test a lot of different workload behaviors. So if we run, so what I mean by that, like if we open up Intel burn test, and just want to demonstrate what Intel burn test looks like running. So we're going to go start. And I'm not sure if yeah, so this is like a Intel burn test transient. And I'm actually not sure if this might not crash, but yeah. The thing is, this is just 1 gig, so it load cycles really, really quickly. So we get a burst of workload, and then it drops back down. So this is like one example of a workload. And what causes that really awful spike is actually, it's not really the actual workload itself. That's the Windows event timer. So if we do a single, and okay, wait. There. So, yeah, so you can actually see, like, here it's idling, and then it comes back up under, like, this is actually IBT running, and this is, like, the downtime between IBT passes, because it needs to load memory, like, load the data into the memory, and then it can start working on it. But anyway, so that horrible spike right there, that's actually caused by the Windows event timer, and it is periodic, well, at stock, it should be every 16.25 milliseconds because the Windows event timer runs at 64 hertz, which is a really sort of random number, but that's what it runs at. And some workloads will actually run that event timer all the way up to 1 millisecond intervals. So you'll be running 1 kilohertz update rate for the event timer. Which can potentially translate in, well, the thing is, it's like, the thing, like, 1 millisecond, like, yeah, like, by one, even if it was, so if we were at 1 millisecond event timer updates, then you'd have one spike there, then another spike at the next division, another spike there, another spike there, another spike there, another spike there, and we're just not seeing that, so, because right now it's running a lot slower, and it wouldn't really do anything because, like, the VRM manages to come back to sort of steady state by around here already. So, you know, and that's after a couple microseconds. So, oops. And I screwed up the purple. Okay, let's put it back down. Zoom out. Anyway, so we're going to put this back to run. So IBT just passed. That's cool and all. If you run something like Cinebench, Cinebench is very mild in terms of transients. So, you know, basically what I mean by that is it looks like that, you know, it's a lot less messy than some of the other workloads out there, right? Like you can see that it's a completely different waveform compared to like Intel burn test running. So, yeah, and it's very mild. We zoom in on that. It's really not that, like, the spike's not that big. The undershoot right here is not that low. Right, and everything here, like, that spike, that's overshoot and undershoot, and obviously the software is not picking up on it because it's, you know, happening way too quickly for any software to pick up on that. Anyway, so Cinebench is also, like, the Cinebench is not a good, like, transient response test most of the time because, well, it just in general, it doesn't cause as violent transients as other workloads. And for Ryzen, the worst case scenario is Prime 95 192K FFT size. So we're going to scroll down here so that we can see the SVI2 TFN voltage reading. We're going to run torture test, small FFTs, and, well, if we run, say, 64K, it's going to look kind of similar to, say, Cinebench, right? So this is 64K FFT size, and I'm just going to blow up the scope window again. So that's not really that bad, right? We are getting about, I'm just going to reset the statistics. So we're getting about 150 millivolts peak to peak. Our minimums are about 1.17 on the die sense, around 1.2 volts average voltage, 1.22 volts average voltage, which makes sense because the SVI2 TFN over here is reading 1.225, and my oscilloscope doesn't show 4 digits for measurements, which just kind of sucks. So yeah, that's as close as it's going to get to displaying 1.225. So, you know, we are running 1.225. CPU is getting pretty hot. This does pull a lot of current. 192K, interestingly enough, does not pull as much current, but it does cause worse transients. So, you know, average voltage on the back of the socket is about 1.29, 1.25 minimums, 150, you know, peak to peak. So that's 64K FFT size. We're just going to stop that. And now we're going to run 192 FFT size. No, that's not a 1. 192. Okay. And yeah, now our peak to peak is in the 200 millivolts range, right? Like you can see it. It's approaching, like occasionally it's hitting like 230, and I think we already dropped a thread. Yeah, we already lost a thread. So we already crashed one of the work threads, right? Because that's a very violent transient. And so what's crashing us is the bottom of that voltage right there. Like any calculation that is occurring during that undershoot is very likely to be wrong. Um, so yeah, that's crashing Prime 95 right now. And if we zoom out, you can see that it's just okay. We need to zoom out a lot. So yeah, and those spikes are periodic with the Windows event timer. And there's an occasional bigger spike that sometimes shows up, but that one's really hard to track. And I'm not sure what causes that. And we're losing, yeah, we just lost another core. So core 10 just dropped and core 12 dropped first. We're gonna stop that. Bam. Right, so spikes go away. And you can see that the actual dicent voltage, like that's not shifting around. It's just the yellow voltage that's going up and down, and that's because we're measuring from the back of the socket. The pink voltage, that one stays the same because that's the actual dicent voltage reading, and we have no droop. There's no droop. There's just tons and tons of overshoot and undershoot because the VRM can't keep up with physics, essentially. Like the big problem that's causing all of that undershoot is that the Windows event timer ticks, and that stalls out Prime 95 when that happens. And then right after it ticks over, Prime 95 goes right back to full load. But our VRM hasn't managed to yet like settle down, so it's still in full like overshoot compensation mode, trying to force the voltage to come down. And when the CPU suddenly decides, hey, I'm going to pull a bunch of current out of nowhere, well, the CPU suddenly pulling a bunch of current out of nowhere forces the voltage to come down even faster, and we get that undershoot, or we get more undershoot, because if we crank up the LLC, then the voltage controller is going to be like, okay, this is actually fine. This overshoot doesn't affect me because, you know, our low load voltage is supposed to be much higher, and we're currently not pushing any current, so the voltage is rising. That's fine. That's completely reasonable. Anyway, I want this to actually blue screen, so let's see if I can get it to do that. So initially it'll be running fine, you know, 1.225 volts, and oh, did it already drop a thread again? I think it did. Yep. So sometimes I get it to blue screen, but most of the time, like, Core 12 just gives up, because Core 12 is the worst core on the entire CPU, and then Core 10 is, like, second worst. Like, you can kind of tell which cores are the worst, because based on which ones drop out first in a workload. So anyway, we're just going to restart at this point, because obviously this isn't stable. It's losing cores, and did we just lose another one? Yeah, we just lost 10. I don't think, like, the thing is, if you lose 2 cores, it might not necessarily, like, it might take so much load out of the system that it might not crash anymore. I was kind of hoping for a blue screen, but it looks like we're not going to get that. In some of the previous attempts, I'd actually get the whole system to just lock up and black screen out of nowhere, but that's when it crashes so hard that even the blue screen doesn't manage to get through. But, yeah, we're not getting there, so now we're going to run that in a way that's like, you saw that. That was crashing very, very quickly. So now we're just going to make it not crash for a long time. I'm not actually going to do like we can't realistically run it for an hour. Or at least I can't if with my policy of not editing videos because I don't like listening to myself. Yeah, I can't really do a, you know, hour-long Prime 95 run. So now we're going to run mode 6. And so one thing I want to note about those spikes that we're seeing on the oscilloscope, because of the fact that I'm using like a 10x passive probe and the scope I'm using and the just the general, and then the active probe being not that great, the measurements that we're seeing on the scope, like when I was doing this testing at Gigabyte HQ, zero Vdroop was doing like 300 millivolts peak to peak in Prime 95. So I do believe that the test setup that I have here is shaving off a good amount of undershoot and overshoot on both ends. And like Unless I get way more expensive test equipment, well, we're not going to see all of that. Which, like, oh yay, the mouse decided to there we go. Okay, now it's behaving normally, so let's get hardware info open. 95. So obviously right now our idle voltage is way higher because I punched in 1.35 volts, right? And at idle, we're not pushing any current. So at idle, we're supposed to be at 1.35 volts. We're not pushing current, so there's not supposed to be Vdroop. So 1.35 volts. DyeSense is reading 1.34. We could argue that that's just the oscilloscope. Well, I mean, if I zoom out a bit, I'm sure the average will go up. Okay, no, that's just, yeah. So, just measurement error. So, it is supposed to be reading 1.35 because the SVI2 TFN sensor is actually measuring from the DyeSense, so it should be seeing the same thing as the active probe, but obviously my active probe just isn't that great. So, anyway, let's run 192K now. And this is with AVX, as this is Prime 95 version 29 something, so that is like all of the AVX. It's just not with as nice a UI. And immediately you can see that, you know, where previously we'd get that, like, we're still getting that horrible overshoot, but we're not getting that massive spike downwards after the overshoot. And the reason for that is now the VRM is like, because what causes that upward spike is the reduction in current draw. And the thing is, we're telling the VRM, hey, if you're pushing 100 amps, drop the voltage. But if you're pushing 10 amps, don't drop the voltage. So when it's, you know, when the CPU goes from pushing, what right now we're looking at like 180 amps at full load, what's going on is the CPU is pushing its 100, you know, pulling in 180 amps, so it's very low resistance. And then when the Windows event timer takes over, the CPU goes high resistance, and all of that current suddenly has to go somewhere else into the capacitor bank, and the voltage starts to rise. And when the voltage starts to rise, our VRM goes like, well, are we pushing that much current? And the conclusion, and in this case, the answer is no. Therefore, it is fine that the voltage is going up as long as we do not exceed the 1.35 volts. Because if you're, or whatever, like, it's not actually 1.35 volts. Like, let's say we're going from 180 amps to 20 amps, then at 180 amps, we're supposed to be at what is it? We're supposed to be at. So at 180 amps, we're supposed to be at 1.206 volts. Right? And at, so what would that be? I can't do that in my head. That's like 1 milliohm, isn't it, though? Because if you have 1.35 minus, okay, no, that's a little bit less than 1 milliohm of droop. Because 180 times watt gives you 150 millivolts. So, yeah, that's probably like 0.75 or 0.8 milliohms of droop of load line. So then at 20 amps, it's supposed to be drooping 16 millivolts, I want to say. Yeah, so at 20 amps, it's supposed to be at, say, 1.32 volts or 1.33 volts. And as long as the peak of that spike is not higher than 1.33 volts, then we're technically in spec. Right, there's not actually overshoot, so the VRM doesn't have to force the voltage to come down, and it can just kind of let it do its thing. So essentially, our VRM is no longer fighting the laws of physics, and it's not losing anymore because it's not fighting them in the first place. If we bring in the purple again, right? Like the thing is, the voltage controller is obviously going off of the purple. It's just clearer what's going on the yellow line, and the yellow line's on the back of the socket, so it's not as accurate, but it is clearer to look at, so that's why I have the yellow line as well. But yeah, now it's a lot more stable, right? Like we're still not crashing, and we're probably, I've not actually seen this crash, which you'll just have to kind of take my word for that this doesn't crash. I've just not seen it do it. Admittedly, I've not run it, like, I think I've run it for a couple minutes, but I've not run it for like several hours, but you know, in comparison to the other settings, like the other settings, we were averaging 1.225 volts. Like it was 1.225 volts on the SVI2 TFN sensor, right? This right here was 1.225 volts. Now we're getting 1.206 volts average voltage, but because we have a lot less undershoot, and a lot less overshoot, actually, we no longer have, actually, do we have less overshoot? Actually, I don't know that we have less overshoot because I don't have maximums enabled, and I'm not going to do the math of adding the peak to the minimum. But yeah, so we have a lot less undershoot. The overshoot might be the same, that's fine. But we don't have so much undershoot. So even though our average voltage is lower, we actually have better stability because our absolute minimum voltage is a lot higher compared to when we were running, no Vdroop. So yeah, this is why we got Vdroop. It basically makes the VRM stop trying to fight the fight the physical capabilities of the voltage. Like, it stops the controller from fighting the physical capabilities of the actual voltage regulator. Because you can tell the voltage controller to aim for 1.225 volts, but realistically, it's never going to be able to actually manage that. So, we tell it, you know what, just relax, just throw a little bit of load line on that, and it's not going to like, the thing is, it's not even overcompensating. It's just not keeping up with how quickly the CPU is going from one load to another load. So in this case, the VRM is just like, oh, yeah, the voltage is going up. That's fine. No big deal. Actually, I think if we zoom in on that, we can sort of see that the VRM actually tries to pull it down here, and then it comes back down, like, well, the thing is, it's really hard. Like, ideally, we'd also have like a graph of what's going on in terms of the CPU, like current flow through the CPU. Unfortunately, I have no idea how you'd actually get a measurement of that. But I would suspect that this is actually caused by, initially we get overshoot from the load release, then the VRM pulls it down a bit, and then the CPU comes back under load, and that's why the voltage, like, why we get this sort of like initial spike and then second spike. So I might actually have a little bit too much droop on it right now. Yeah, like, as you can clearly see, very stable, right? Very, very stable. We've still not lost core 12. We've still not lost core 10. It just passed a loop. And we're running in the 90s. So it's running just as hot as ever. Well, actually, like, right now it's running so hot because the water the water loop is actually warmed up. So yeah, that is why Vdroop is good. Now, would I recommend that you run LLC 6 on this motherboard? Actually, maybe yes. I'm not like 100% sold on it yet because, well, the issue is, like, this oscilloscope is just not that sensitive. So I've also done tests for every single LLC except 7 and 8, I think, or no, I tested 7. I just didn't test 8. But basically, so 1 through 7, the thing is, so 1 is terrible. 1 is just awful. You should never use 1. 2 is basically as bad as 1. 3 looks to be about as bad as 2, but you're starting to get into the, like, well, is it my oscilloscope making it look that bad, or is it actually that bad? Then 4, because the difference between 1 and 2 is 10 millivolts. The difference between 2 and 3 is 0 millivolts, but again, my oscilloscope doesn't show less than 10 millivolt differences because it just doesn't do that. There are scopes that do that. They cost way more money than this one. Then we have level 4, which, according to my oscilloscope, is 20 millivolts better than level 3. And then level 5 is apparently about 10 millivolts better. Actually, no. Level 4 is about 10 millivolts better than level 3. Then level 5 is about 10 millivolts better than level 4. Level 6 is about 10 millivolts. Yeah, level 6 is about 10 millivolts better than level 5. So considering that all of them are sort of within margin of error of my lovely scope here, it's not really clear if, like, level 6 or 5 or 4 are optimal because they're kind of too close together. But level 1 definitely sucks, and level 2 does too. Level 3, I'd say, also sucks, and then between 4, 5, and 6, it's like, I wish I had better test equipment, and then I might be able to tell you. But level 6 definitely does a good job, right? It's just, like, well, the thing is also on other workloads, like if we stop this, potential issue that you might run into is like, okay, so it does a good job at 192K because it minimizes the undershoot, But if we run something like 64K, where we pull a bit more current, then we might have a problem with the actual Vdroop pulling the voltage a bit too low. Which doesn't actually seem to be a problem. And there's even less of a, like, that's actually really clean. Oh, wait, no, I just don't have the second spike in there, but... Actually, there's, like, no undershoot on this now. So, yeah. I guess level 6 LLC is actually pretty damn good. So... Anyway, we're just going to stop that. So that's kind of it. Not removing all of your Vdroop will actually make your overclock less stable. That's the main takeaway from this video. Does this actually answer how you should test for Vdroop? Kinda? Like, yeah, kinda. It does. So basically, like, don't walk your voltage up and then crank up the LLC. What you should start with is... because basically, if you raise the average voltage, then the minimum voltage goes up with it. So you can't, like, compare 1.35 level 6 versus 1.35 level 1, because 1.35 level 1 is going to have an average voltage of 1.35, and therefore the undershoot is going to be pushed up by, what is it, like almost 150 millivolts? Not really, but not really, because there's going to be, like, the undershoot gets worse the more current you have flowing through the system, so the higher the voltage you're at, the more current there is to cause the undershoots, but, and the overshoot, but... Yeah, so essentially, like, you want to like, you'd basically want to do a stability test at matched SVI2 TFN voltages, and then fiddle with the LLC settings to see which one is actually the most stable. And it will be really time intensive, unfortunately. Yeah. So, like, this is why we have Vdroop. Like, I just wanted to show that, like, there. Vdroop is not, like... Like, I know, because for a very long time, you know, it's been that, oh, Vdroop is this horrible thing that you have to remove with LLC, and then it's like, well, no. Like, if you remove all of the Vdroop, things just get worse, actually. And if you remove too much Vdroop, there are some motherboards where, like, the stock amount of Vdroop is too much. But in a lot of cases, like, once you start getting into the really aggressive LLC settings, like for MSI level 1, level 2, level 3... you're actually making the undershoot worse by going up to these really aggressive load line slopes. Or, actually, they're not aggressive slopes. They're more like really shallow load lines because you're just flattening it out more and more. So, yeah. Also, if you have a lower core count CPU that pulls less current, then level 6 is actually going to droop less. Right, like, that's the thing, is, like, level 6 here, because we're on a 3950X, we can pull 180 amps. But if I was on a 3700X with level 6, that CPU only pulls 100 amps at most. So it's not going to droop as far because it only pulls 100 amps. So, you know, when the voltage controller is doing its droop calculation, instead of going 1 milliohm times or 0.8 milliohms times 180 amps, it's going to go 0.8 milliohms times 100 amps, which is 80 millivolts of droop, not, like, here we have, like, 150 millivolts of droop, right, for these settings right now. But if I had an 8-core, we'd probably have closer to 80 millivolts of droop. So, and if you had a 6-core, you'd have, like, 60 millivolts of droop or something. Like, you'd have even less again. So, anyway, yeah, that's it for this video, at last. And I made it too long again, so nobody's gonna watch it, but Droop's good. So, thanks for watching. Thank you to the patrons for, you know, the oscilloscope, and the probes, and the CPU, and the memory, and the, well, not actually the power supply in this case. And thank you to MSI for the X570 Godlike. I will also be doing comparisons between all of my X570 motherboards. It's just a real hassle to set this up because, well, like, getting the probe behind the back of on the back of the CPU socket, that's easy. The problem is the die sense. Like, hooking up to the die sense just absolutely sucks. So that's kind of been the thing that's been stalling out me doing these videos for so long, because I wanted to do this comparison for a while, and the first one I'll be doing is obviously the Godlike versus the Aorus Extreme, because I do wonder how the doubled 14 phase of the Godlike compares to the true 14 phase of the Aorus Extreme. Like, I don't know. Like, well, I'm not sure how much of a difference we'll see. That's why I want to do the test. Like, on paper, you would assume the Gigabyte board is gonna win, but who knows? We'll see. So, yeah. Anyway, that's it for the video. So like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. There's also a Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, stickers, posters, that kind of thing, which achieves the same thing as the Patreon does. So, if you'd like to check that out, that would be awesome. And what else was there? That's actually it. Yeah. Oh, yeah, there's links to the Patreon and the Teespring down in the description below. So, thanks for watching, and goodbye.